We've touched on issues of sustainability throughout the morning, and I'm delighted to introduce three excellent panelists to take that conversation forward. To my left, we have Karl Hallding from the Stockholm Environment Institute. We have Aida Sitdikova, who is the Director for Energy Eurasia at the EBRD's Sustainable Infrastructure Group. And finally, we have Damian Nussbaum, who's the Director of Economic Development here at the City of London Corporation. Thank you all for joining us. In my work beyond Belt and Road, just day to day, it strikes me that sustainability is really shooting up the agenda for many investors, be it equity investors and shareholder pressure on companies, whether it's debt markets and the importance, the growing attraction of green bonds, or whether it's through the bank market where banks are putting pressure on their clients to act in a more sustainable fashion. I'd like to try and look at that through a BRI context. If I could start with you, Karl. Let's take it at a very high level. Can the Belt and Road be green, or is it destined to be brown?
I think that's a very important question for us in the world facing climate change, and particularly a runaway climate change beyond a point of no return. So regardless of how green it is, the real problem is how much brown could the Belt and Road add without us coming beyond that point of no return. So from the highest level, according to President Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road Initiative is green, it's healthy, it's intelligent, and it's peaceful. So we should all rest assured that this is a good initiative. But I think there are three important questions to ask around it. At the same time as it holds the promise of blue skies and clear water, the evidence, if we look back at real investment streams from China, it's much more brown than green. Then how brown or how green it is depends on how far back you actually look in those investment streams. It's getting a bit greener in later years, I must admit. Then another thing which we discussed earlier in the panel is it was launched as an initiative, some sort of offer to the world about development. But I think we need to see it, and I think the first panel touched upon that as well. It's a label for a fairly ambitious Chinese foreign policy, a foreign policy that changed when President Xi Jinping came into offer, a kind of 180-degree turn of Chinese foreign policy. I think it's important to keep that in mind. And then finally, it's an offer of partnership. But the original idea of the Belt and Road, the Harmonious China World Plan, was an idea about getting rid of overcapacity in fairly dirty, heavy manufacturing industry in China.
Thank you very much. That's extremely useful. If I could turn to you, Aida. In your work at the EBRD, you're very involved in Belt and Road countries, and your investments are very much in green power. Could you maybe sketch a little bit how that you've interacted with Chinese projects and BRI investments in your work?
Sure. Just before that, just to stress, there are two themes that I see covering the BRI and how EBRD and other multinational development banks are treating it. First is the sheer scale. Obviously, is the 2/3 of the global population. It's 50% of GDP. It's 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it's a huge geographic expanse as well. For us, as we say, it's from Morocco to Mongolia, for our bank, for our countries of operations. But it obviously goes beyond that. Enormous investments are required in the infrastructure, will be required. We're talking in trillions of dollars. We're talking different assessment of $1 to $8 trillion by 2050. There will be a markup for decarbonized assets of 5–10%, arguably. Another 30% on top of that if we are to reach the UN Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement alignment. So these are huge numbers, very ambitious targets, and long-term assets. We're talking assets of 20 to 50 years. Assets that will be sitting there, and it takes me to another theme or rather an imperative to make the right choices and to make them rather quickly. You were referring to the urgency. We all know about the UN IPCC report from last November, where 1.5 degree centigrade number was tabled in the next 11 years. So the BRI countries in this context play an enormous part. If all greenhouse gas emissions, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions will come, future gas, GHG, will come from infrastructure investments, and 50% of that will be associated with BRI countries. If those countries stay on their present pattern of carbon intensity, and we are talking about some very carbon-intensive countries, for example, Central Asia, the world will, these countries will eat up the world carbon budget, 75% of it, by 2040. So really relevant to get it right quickly, and to engage across a range of stakeholders. MDBs, multinational banks, multilateral banks, ourselves, ADB, AIB was mentioned, are really seeing it that way, where we at EBRD close the door on any coal-fired generation or any coal, thermal coal. There were severe constraints on upstream oil extraction. So we are looking at fossil fuels as investments that have inherent risks. And for BRI countries, this would be the very important aspect, because some of them have the legacy of fossil fuel investments. Some of them have legacy of substantial Chinese investments in the fossil fuel. And now they have to shift through both policy work and projects by ourselves, and the policy work by ourselves, and other institutions and players. They have to shift to a greener future, obviously. And again, as I said, China can play a very important role in helping the world to decarbonize. We've seen a dramatic drop in solar panel modules over the last 5 years, largely driven by the brutal competition within China. We've seen the same story for wind manufacturers. So China could be a part of the solution. It's part the BRI initiative, or rather the strategic direction, because it's not something very specific. It could be, it's large. It could pose challenges, but it could be a part of a solution as well, if the Chinese economy harnesses it in a proper way and makes the whole world benefit from it.
Thank you. Damian, I started by talking about how European institutions are more and more keen on making sure that their work is sustainable. In your work, seeking to forge links between China and the UK, do you think that that agenda exists at all among Chinese institutions and potential partners in China?
I think the answer is increasingly so. But I mean, starting from where Aida left off, there's the sense that BRI could be the most incredible engine for growth and lifting people out of poverty, but that could be done in an incredibly polluting way, or a way that is much greener, bluer, and more sustainable. And so there is a real fork in the road as to which direction we're going to go in. On the Chinese side, we've been working very closely. We run the Green Finance Initiative across the city with many people who are sitting here, and we're about to launch the Green Finance Institute with Treasury and many partners in the summer. One of the key partners that we've been working with is China, and particularly we've set up a Green Finance task force with the Green Finance Committee, China Green Finance Committee, Ma Jun, and many others. And I think we've been incredibly impressed over the last 3 or 4 years, the appetite, not just for sort of top-level intention, which if you read the MOU with the Italians, for instance, there's lots of green intention in there. It's very difficult to see how that translates itself into effect. What we've been looking to do is to see how we can translate the clear direction of travel that we have seen and experienced at high levels in China, how do you translate that into something that is going to really shape the kind of projects that we're going to see rolling out over the 60 or 70 BRI countries? So with the Chinese, we've come up with a set of green investment principles, very closely aligned to the UNPRI, and these are interesting, particularly in the context of Chinese institutions that traditionally have been a little bit hesitant at signing up to ESG principles that have been produced elsewhere. What we wanted to do was to work with the Chinese in a way that would feel much more like a made in China in partnership, and that would have real bite. So we are going to be launching those principles in 3 weeks' time at the BRI conference. And these are principles that already the 4 largest Chinese banks have signed up to, that Standard Chartered have signed up to, and that quite a few other Western banks are either in the process of signing up to or have actually signed. I think this is crucial in translating good intentions into good effect, because once you have the principles and you're clear what you're aiming to achieve, you can then look for what is good practice, what are the case studies, what are the kind of ways that we can build capacity. And I think there's both a huge opportunity and a responsibility then to work with Chinese institutions, not just in China and here, but right across the BRI countries for mutual learning. This is a partnership. This is not one way. How can we learn from each other in order to drive up the green outcomes that we all want to see?
How much do you think this is part of what we heard from the first panel onwards about a sort of an aim to make the BRI a little more cuddly, if you like, a little friendlier, a little less harsh in intent? Do you think that what you're describing is recognition in Beijing that they need to change their approach a little bit?
I think it absolutely is. Whether that's sort of cuddly or seeing that the political necessities is a different thing. And I think what is behind the question is the sense of, so how much traction, how much bite, how much difference will this make? It's absolutely the right question. And the answer is, it's how much we and the Chinese make it. So this is not, as it were, a baked, finished product. This is going to be a journey which either ends at a high level of ambition or at a lower level of ambition. But I think the signs are very positive. We were, the Lord Mayor was seeing Vice President Wang Qishan 2 or 3 weeks ago. Both the reaffirmation of greater internationalization was strongly there, but also to this agenda. And I think the sense is that in terms of Chinese finance, which is becoming ever more sophisticated very quickly, this is also being seen as an opportunity. It's not being seen as something external that's being done to Chinese institutions. This is as much an opportunity for Chinese financial institutions to be at the forefront of global finance as it is for them to be making strong statements about the kind of infrastructure development they want to see globally.
Karl?
Damian, I think what you point to there in terms of finding common language, definitions and so on are very important. And I having followed Chinese development since mid-1980s, I see that there is a tendency, as you say, of high-level pronouncements. I would say that since mid-90s, if you listen to the leaders, economic development and environmental concerns have always walked hand in hand in China, and we've seen a country that is suffocating in emissions, getting worse every year. So there is some sort of disconnect between the language, the definitions, and what's happening on the ground. And I led an interesting conversation a year and a half ago at Tsinghua University with some of the leading thinkers from the origin of the BRI and Chinese researchers in this field. And I asked them, what's green development? Could coal be green? And they said, yes, yeah, coal could be green. It depends on the context in the partner country. If it's a Central Asia country where they have a lot of assets in fossil fuels, then coal is a green option. So I think we need to come, to understand, to come down to that level of, finding clear definitions. What is green? Could ultra-critical coal power be labeled as green or not? And I think in your bank, Aida, you would probably have a more stringent view on that than what's apparently the case among the finance institutions that are funding the the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. We're very mindful of the 11-year time frame for the point of no return. But just to answer your question, I think a lot depends on the recipient countries along the BRI route. A lot depends on their policies, regulatory environment, the institutional capacity, because some of them are indeed locked in a very long-term polluting coal-dominated, like Kazakhstan, infrastructure. But at the same time, there has to be political will to shift away, to impose new standards. So when foreign investors come into a country, funded potentially by public sector, but also at some point private money, there is a fit with what the Chinese companies and the Chinese investors would like to see and what the country would impose as their standards. It's really, I mean, it was mentioned that the pace is quickening and the Chinese investors are becoming more adapted, more adjusted to the requirements, as long as the requirements are there. We see the problem that some sectors are lacking Chinese presence, and those sectors are renewables, for example. A case in point, again, Kazakhstan, I come back to that. It's the country that benefited in billions of dollars from Chinese sponsors in the oil and gas sector. And we've seen very, very little in terms of renewables. Last year, we financed 400 megawatt in Kazakhstan, of which only 100 came from a quite sizable Chinese manufacturer. So why are they so shy? Is it the risk aversion that they see? Are they not confident about their ability to deliver to the standards? I would argue no, they are quite confident. And we've seen on our projects we financed, they can deliver very good quality standards that are meeting environmental requirements, procurement, etc. So it's the question of political will of the countries themselves.
I'd like to take that forward a bit. I mean, clearly, when we look at global warming, when we look at sustainability, China is, in many senses, the biggest problem. It's the world's biggest emitter. Emissions are still growing. But it's certain that a lot of the solutions lie in China. And the Chinese economy is dominant in batteries. It's dominant in solar, as you said, increasingly powerful in wind, looking to dominate electric vehicles. So it's going to be a huge part of the solution. So I wonder if the three of you would be able to comment on how that translates into a BRI context and how they may take those industries into the development of the Belt and Road. Should we start with you, Karl?
Yeah, I think this question about, we talk about China all the time, but of course in China there are among the best green energy producers and equipment producers and components for solar and wind. But we also have the absolutely best coal power plant manufacturers. And those coal power plant manufacturers, they don't get any new contract in China. So they follow the Belt and Road and look for new opportunities overseas. So I think there is a very interesting inside China debate potentially, which is not so easy for us to get into. So where I think different companies with different solutions are in fact competing with one another for access to the Belt and Road. Now I ask myself why isn't there more renewables along the Belt and Road when they have the best producers of renewable components? I think that's something I just would like to know why.
Is it because there's less of a surplus in the Chinese renewable? There's still a market at home, whereas, as you quite rightly say, there's less of a market. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Aida.
Well, I think, just to answer your question directly, the things that we would like to see in the future, battery storage, smart grids, electric vehicles, if anybody can can have the capacity to pull it through, that would probably be China, just because of the sheer scale, ability to commercialize things, move very quickly. So innovation is something really would be good to see coming from China along the BRI route. In terms of why, answering your question, I don't have an answer, and we've been thinking about this ourselves. Even for the frontier Central Asia countries that lie so close to China, we don't see much of immediate spillover effect. But it is starting, it's trickling down. I think once a Chinese sponsor gets comfortable with regulatory risk in the country, with political risks, once they have not necessarily Chinese sources of funding, they want to get out there, they start coming. So that's where the hope is.
And I was reflecting on what are the pressures that may come to bear to encourage, to ensure that BRI is as green in its development as possible. I think actually companies, Chinese companies, looking for commercial opportunities could be one. But exactly as you said, there are some big coal plant manufacturers who are interested too. So there's an interesting internal Chinese question there. But certainly in terms of offshore wind, I remember in a previous life looking at the possibilities of exporting wind turbines to China and giving up on that one very quickly because the strength in depth there is extraordinary. But also, the nuclear capacity in the sort of broader sustainable context is very strong. So, another area. But I'd expand it out. I'd say actually the pressures are going to come from MDBs are going to be incredibly important in the kind of pressures around the projects that are going forward. The companies that are looking to get supply chain wins are going to be important. But I think actually consumers, Chinese consumers might be quite an interesting part of this, partly as part of the internal Chinese conversation, and partly as part of the very quickly developing Chinese consumer market. We are just launching a new initiative in the next few months in, I think it's Beijing, of a green finance kind of lab. So looking at how UK client-facing green finance products could be adapted for a Chinese client consumer market. And I think the kind of pressures where people have choices about where their pensions go, the equivalent to ISAs and so on, could be a really interesting way that some pressure is brought to bear.
Ultimately, the tension that you highlight, Karl, between different parts of the Chinese economy is going to have to be resolved at the very highest policy level. In your work in terms of Chinese policy, do you think that's likely to happen? Do you think that the center of gravity in China is shifting towards a greener economy, or do the forces of reaction in this regard remain very strong?
Well, to be honest with you, Will, I'm not so optimistic right now. I think there is a real problem within the Chinese political economy that is actually underlying a lot of these things that we see happening, and we don't understand how and why do they happen. I mean, Chinese companies do not have, shareholders' value doesn't really exist in China in the same way as it does in our economies. So there's some of the very basic drivers of economic development and thrift that is not there. I think one very illustrating example is the growth of steel industry in China in the first 10 years of this millennium, where China added as much steel manufacturing capacity to the world as the world had by year 2000. This is a very polluting industry, and they became the world's biggest supplier of steel, but they also built up a huge overcapacity that is roughly a third of total capacity in the world is overcapacity, and it's in China. So there's an economy that has the ability to develop huge overcapacities and to operate on very low capacity utilization ratios, and that is not good for the environment, basically. So there is it's an underlying problem, I think, in the political economy.
let me just, we've only got a few minutes left. Let me just broaden the definition of sustainability a little bit, because we focus very much, I think for good reasons, on the environment and carbon. But of course, there is a broader agenda here about making projects as sustainable for the countries, recipient countries, as possible. I wonder, Aida, if you could talk a little bit about how you approach those issues when you're working and put out in a BRI context.
Yeah, we are generally governed by SDGs, which are quite comprehensive, and it really ranges from the debt sustainability we discussed earlier in the morning to competitive, transparent procurement of goods and services, tenders where we, as an institutional lender, have very rigorous requirements, to environmental standards, to the aspects of inclusion, gender equality in all our projects, in youth employment, in wider economic benefits that surround the project that we finance. This also goes hand in hand with policy. So we have this double-pronged approach of policy work and financing specific projects and leveraging our money to get the governments accept the policy work, even for the private sector, where our requirements, or the best international requirements, would be accepted and would be attractive to foreign investors.
And Damian, do you think that, what's your opinion about how those broader sustainability goals, going back to your comments earlier, fit into the agenda you're trying to drive with Chinese institutions?
Absolutely critical, I think, and the SDGs providing the kind of aspirational framework that we need to make sure that the outcomes are much more balanced. Look, I mean, we're all clear that there is a danger in a slowing world economy that people start refocusing on the economy stupid and the economy in a very narrow sense. I think that there is a danger in China as much as anywhere else that those kind of political choices are going to be made. I think one of the key drivers needs to be around what is the long term, and I think China has always been so strong at having a sense of what are the long-term outcomes, and I think we need to have the kind of strength of partnerships in place, the sense of what is the long-term prize, and the data, and I think a really important point made earlier around data, to be able to understand what is really going on with the project, so we understand which choices are being made on the ground, not just at the top level in terms of the communiques.
Thank you very much. We've just got a couple of minutes left. I'll ask you a quick unfair question. When we hold this meeting in 10 years' time, do you think that BRI will have added to the global carbon emissions, or it's been able to be part of the fight against climate change?
Well, it's already adding to carbon emissions, so it will have added to carbon emissions as well, unless all of those projects are already being built, would have been terminated before 10 years.
So what about the rate of, can they change the curve? Can we bend the curve?
Absolutely. There is an enormous capacity, as Aida said, in China to actually deliver green solutions. And we need to partner up with those initiatives in China to deliver something that is transformative enough.
Are you optimistic, Aida? Can we bend the curve?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think it will be a mixed situation probably in 10-year time. But if there are the right incentives to harness the Chinese might in terms of renewables, innovative solutions, in terms of clean infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, the sky is the limit, I think, for the BRI countries, assuming they have the proper regulatory framework on the ground.
I think cautiously optimistic as well. I think we'll be saying the rate of human progress over that 10 years will have been just phenomenal in terms of the people lifted out of poverty, but I think there will be a healthy and lively debate as to whether that could have been done in an even more carbon-reducing way.
Thank you very much, everyone, for a very stimulating conversation. I hope that we got to some of the issues around sustainability in BRI, and I thank you all for your contributions. Please join me in thanking the panel.